And let me just start my sharing my screen. Okay, so oops, no, this is the wrong slide. Okay, let me find the right slide. Let me stop sharing and then start sharing again. Right now, here it is. So do I have the right slide now? I mean, can you see it? It's different from yeah, this one. So I'll be talking about the science of flooding, and along the way, sharing with you facts, and at the same time also some of the few myths that surround the issue on flooding. And you know, this is a very timely topic for us to talk about, and for both Christians and non-Christians, knowing or understanding the science of flooding is an important thing to have, you know. And in the past, we have dealt with many severe flooding events, and I was part, for instance, of the task force that assessed the Ormoc City flood that killed more than 5,000 people in one barangay, and then also was part of a team that did a rapid assessment on what happened during the 2004 flooding in Real, Infanta, and General Nakar. And in both these cases, together with the recent flooding that we experienced, with the recent typhoons that visited us, you know, the same things are repeated over and over. And it seems like, as what many are saying in the newspapers, you know, it seems that we have not really learned, you know, from the previous flooding events, because every time that a serious typhoon comes, you know, the flooding is always associated, and the damages that are associated with typhoons are actually amplified by the damages caused by flooding. Understanding the science of flooding is essential in that regards. You know, in order for us to find a lasting and true solution to our flooding problems, and be able to reduce the risks that are always associated with flooding, we ought to understand how it operates as a natural process. Understanding, for all we know, is an important process towards making the right decision. And it is the intent of this presentation to explore with you how flooding occur as a natural process. And as you read from the advertisement, from the posts in Facebook, this is part, or the first part, of back-to-back messages about natural disasters. For this particular session, we'll be talking about specifically on flooding, and then next week, the second part of this, particularly on the discussion of natural disaster occurrence from spiritual standpoint, will be handled by none other than our Pastor Noel Espinosa. But for this time, you know, I'm going to concentrate on flooding, because flooding is such a serious problem that we contend with, you know, almost yearly, actually, or almost yearly, you know, and yet it seems like a solution is far from our reach. And hopefully understanding, you know, flooding among us, in our own little way, can help solving this problem, even if in our own locality and area of influence. So let me begin my discussion for tonight with this slide, answering the question, where does the river water come from? No? Where does it come from? Saan ba nanggaling yung tubig sa ilog? No? Now, allow me to show you these visuals. This is a profile of a watershed, and as you can see here, the river is visualized as a container. Because it is a container. It is a container of water, and the water that is filling up this river or this container comes from 4 various sources. The first one is, of course, rainfall. Rainfall directly falling in the river. That is a major contributor also, especially if you have a lot of rivers, within a particular basin, then it can contribute a lot of water directly into the river. And then there is also what we call process of infiltration that eventually leads to percolation, water penetrating the soil, and then continuously moving vertically downwards until it joins the groundwater reserve, and that this groundwater reserve contributes to the water flowing in the river, and as you can see here. And then there is also what we call subsurface runoff. This is part of the water that is absorbed by the soil but cannot flow directly or downward to the groundwater reserve, because there is an impervious layer preventing it from moving downward. And as you can see, the impervious layer can be anything. It can be rock layers, or it can be a highly compacted soil in the under the ground. And this infiltrated water moves sidewards or laterally, because they cannot move downward until they find a way out of the slope and onto the river. And it contributes as well to the amount of water that is in the river. But as you can see here, the river cannot be, or is not filled up by water coming from groundwater and coming from subsurface runoff and even rainfall, because the larger portion of the water flowing in the river, especially, or not especially, but during rain event, is what we call surface runoff. And surface runoff is the amount of rain that is not absorbed by the soil, and that portion accumulates on the surface of the ground, and then they start flowing under the force of gravity over sloping areas, and then they directly end up in rivers, and then and that they usually, it is from the runoff that the river is being filled up with water. And if there's so much runoff, then that's where we see overflowing of the river into an area which we call floodplain. And floodplains are usually those areas in the lowland plains, in the valleys, which are naturally the areas where water overflowing from the rivers are spread out, and that is what we call, flooding. And as you can see, flooding is a natural process. It is not, a process that is made by man, because by nature, flood occurs. Even without the influences of human activities, flood occurs by nature's doing. Okay, and keep in mind, in this particular slide, that soil has limited capacity to absorb water, river has limited capacity to hold water, and that flood is a natural process, and floodplain are areas that naturally gets flooded when water overflows its banks. Now, I think that the next question really is, so why does the water overflow the banks of the rivers? Because even if there's surface runoff, it does not necessarily mean that it will overflow its bank, especially when the amount of surface runoff that is filling up the river is not sufficient to fill it up and cause the water to overflow its banks. But if it does, the question is where or what triggers high volume of surface runoff that eventually ends up in rivers. And there are three major direct factors here. One is there's simply just too much runoff. I'll come back to this in a little while. And too much runoff is because there's just too much rain, and that there is slow infiltration, or there's slow absorption of water by the soil. And then when this happens, when there's just too much rainwater, we know that the water cannot be absorbed totally by the soil, because the soil, as we said in the previous slide, the soil has limited capacity to absorb. And that is because of three particular conditions of the soil that can prevent it from absorbing all the rainwater. One is saturated, meaning if the soil can be saturated with water, it has a limited capacity. Therefore, if it is filled up, that is the condition where soil is saturated with water, then that means that it has limited capacity to absorb. But the absorption of water by the soil can also be limited by compacted soil due to poor land uses. For instance, improper cultivation or farming practices, improper grazing practices that can compact the soil because of overgrazing the area. Or it can be that the soil is naturally poor in its ability to permeate or allow water to pass through it. There are soil that have very low ability to allow the transmission or to allow the passage of water through it. And if you know the general types of soil that we have sand, silt, and clay. Clay soil being a soil that is usually highly compacted compared to the others, relatively high density compared to the others. Usually, this soil are the least that are able to absorb much water compared to the other types of soil. So these are the factors why the soil cannot absorb all the rain that falls on the ground. And then second is that, okay. All right, now the next thing about the overflowing of the rivers because of too much runoff, related to that, if too much water is coming in a very short period of time, that is a fast concentration of surface runoff in major rivers, we expect that the river can overflow anytime, especially when the rate of incoming surface runoff is much greater than the rate at which water is being discharged at the outlet of the river. Now, what are the reasons why the concentration of surface runoff in major rivers becomes so fast, right? We don't want a surface runoff that is moving so fast on the surface of the ground, because again, that spells disaster, because most of the runoff coming from all over the watershed can meet in the river, in a very short period of time, that can cause the river to swell beyond its capacity. And the reasons for fast movement of surface runoff on the surface is one, a lack of vegetation. Imagine the soil surface as a smooth surface without any trees or vegetation. When your surface is very smooth, surface runoff is going to be very, very fast. And that is what we don't want. And that is one of the one important function of vegetation, especially forests, because they tend to slow down the movement of surface runoff downslope. Second is that there are many rivers or many tributaries or many branches. And when there are many rivers in a particular basin, surface runoff easily finds its way to a channel. And when water or surface runoff finds a channel, they can move very, very quickly compared to when they are moving on the surface of the soil. And again, you know, when you have a lot of branches and tributaries of the main river, then you expect that your main river is going to rise up very quickly, especially when there's too much rain. And then third is because of steep basin slopes. Okay, when you have a steep slope, your tendency will be, or the tendency of the surface runoff will be to move very, very quickly. And then lastly, because of impervious surfaces. Now, what are these impervious surfaces? An example of this will be areas that are highly compacted, or areas that are paved or concreted, areas that that are associated usually with urbanization or human settlements or industrial parks development or even road development. These are the areas that are impervious and that they cannot absorb water, and hence most of the rain or all of the water coming from the rain will just accumulate on the surface and become surface runoff. So these are the factors that cause the fast movement of surface runoff in the basin. And then lastly, you know, we said that the capacity of the river to hold water is limited. And hence, when there's too much surface runoff, it simply just cannot contain that safely until they are drained out of the outlet. And what are the conditions that the limited capacity of a river to hold water can further be limited or further be diminished? There are two ways. One is when the riverbed is silted due to massive soil erosion that is happening on upstream or in upstream areas due to poor land use practices. Okay, and the land use practices can be very, very erosive, especially when those practices are being done in the wrong places at the wrong time, especially when they're doing intensive land use activities in sloping areas that are usually prone to soil erosion. And then second is because they are obstructed either naturally or by illegal structures. And this is very common because most of the easements of our natural waterways, of our rivers, are common areas for occupation by those without resources to buy, you know, their own areas for their settlements, you know, which that are usually in safer areas than the stream banks. And this is usually, you know, this is a very common scenery, especially in urbanizing areas such as in the provinces of Bulacan and Pampanga. You know, there's a lot of stretches of the rivers in Bulacan and Pampanga that are occupied both for settlement and also for fish ponds and other illegal structures that impede the free flow of water out to the sea or out to the bay. So what are the natural predisposing factors for flooding? Okay, this is just a recapitulation of what we already discussed. One is excessive rain. When there's too much rain, expect that there's going to be flooding. And, you know, and this is perhaps the minimum requirement for flood to occur. And that is why every time there is a forecast of heavy downpour, we all receive through our cell phone an alert message from NDRRMC telling us to be warned that there is a possibility of flooding, when there is too much rain being forecasted. And then second is the soil condition, and most specifically the moisture condition of the soil. If the soil is dry, then the soil is able to absorb, a lot of the rain, and usually, they can absorb as much as 35% of rainfall. But once the soil is saturated, if the heavy downpour continues on for much longer, then we expect that there will be a lot of runoff that will start to form and flow downstreams. And then another, keep in mind that there is certain amount of rain for certain soil moisture condition that can trigger flood of magnitude that is dependent on the physical and ecological features of a watershed. In other words, when there's too much rain and when the soil is saturated, we expect that there will be a lot of runoff, and the possibility of flooding is very high. Now, if you factor in other features of the watershed or of the basin, and what you see here is an example of a watershed, if this watershed is experiencing, for instance, ecological degradation, such as deforestation, such as poor agricultural areas and poor grassland areas, you expect that this impact of excessive rainfall and saturated soil condition is going to be magnified. So in other words, what I'm saying is that excessive rainfall, again, as I said, is the minimum requirement for flooding to occur. And you add to that, a soil that is saturated with water, then that can form a lot of surface runoff. And then if you add to that the condition of the watershed surface itself, then that will further amplify the destructive effects of flooding, that may occur. And there is a threshold amount of rainfall that can trigger flood that varies from one watershed to another. Now, if you ask me what this threshold amount of rainfall that can trigger flood is, it's a matter, for me, it's a matter for further study, because there is so much factors that determine, what kind of rainfall is going to be a trigger to flooding, and how much flooding is going to actually result from such flooding. And this is something that that hasn't been really studied well, especially here in our country. Okay, but what NDRRMC is doing is to actually just be very cautious. They adhere to the principle, the precautionary principle, in that even if we don't know or certain about the magnitude of risks, okay, they operate conservatively, assuming that the worst is coming, and so that people can be forewarned if indeed it happened. And then high drainage density. Okay, that's what we mentioned in the previous slide. If you have more streams, the water is going to move more quickly to the main river. Okay, and that usually spells rapid rising of the level of water in the streams. And the more branches, the faster the water moves in the watershed. And then the steep profile of the watershed, the steep slope of the watershed, can also spell rapid movement of surface runoff. It's just physics, right? If the slope of the surface is steeper, okay, compared to another slope which is gentler, the movement of water on the steeper surface is going to be much faster than in surface, which with gentler slopes. And with that, those are what we call the natural predisposing factors. Those are factors that if you imagine, there's really nothing much we can do about them. It's like they are given, and that we have to learn how to live with those given natural factors. We cannot do much about them, but we can try to live with them and adjust, make an adjustments or adaptation to it so that we can minimize damages associated with them. But ecosystem degradation is something that is within our control. And we'll look at forest degradation, agroecosystem degradation. Agroecosystems, includes agroforestry and agricultural areas. And then we will talk about a little bit on urban ecosystem degradation, grassland degradation, river degradation, and mangrove ecosystem degradation. So let's begin with, anyway, it flashed there. So what I'm just reminding you about is that ecological degradation is a failure of stewardship and land use control and nothing more, okay? We are responsible for it. We fail in our stewardship and we fail in controlling the way we use our land. And what we can see here in the succeeding slides is that ecological degradation compounds the risks from flood. So before I move on to ecosystem or forest degradation and its impacts and contribution to the risks of flooding, let me just discuss with you the role of the forest. How does it influence, the movement of water in a particular basin or watershed? Consider a scenario 1 here, where you have dry or unsaturated soil. The infiltration here will be very high, especially when you have a good cover, forest cover. When you have an area with less forest cover, you will have less infiltration. Okay, so that's under dry condition of the soil. Second scenario, saturated soil. Under saturated soil, meaning to say the soil is already filled up with water, infiltration is going to be very minimal, even if you have good forest cover. And that is true also for areas with less forest cover, okay? The infiltration rate is also going to be very minimal, okay? No difference basically between areas with good forest cover and areas with less forest cover. And then let's look at the influence on surface runoff of good forest. Scenario 1, unsaturated soil. You expect that when the soil is unsaturated, surface runoff is going to be low. And when you have less forest cover, that area will have higher surface runoff compared to surface runoff in areas covered with more forest. Now let's look at saturated condition. Under saturated condition, even if you have good forest cover, your runoff is going to be high. And this is the same for areas with less forest cover. Surface runoff is going to be high, basically, without much difference from areas with adequate forest cover. Now let's combine both of them. Scenario 1, dry soil. Infiltration is going to be very high if you have good forest cover, and surface runoff is going to be low. Now in areas with less forest cover, you will have less infiltration, but you will have more surface runoff. Now in a saturated condition of the soil, your infiltration is going to be really minimum in areas with adequate forest cover, and your runoff is going to be high because your infiltration is low. I mean, these two processes are opposite each other. If infiltration is low, runoff is high. If the infiltration is high, surface runoff is low. That's just, you know, how it works. And if you have less forest cover, infiltration is going to be minimum, but surface runoff is going to be more or less very high, equal to areas with good forest cover. So what this is telling us is that good forest alone, good forest alone cannot prevent flood, because there is a limit to its influence to absorb water. Once the soil is already saturated with water, it can no longer absorb any further additional rainfall that may occur, okay, because the soil is already filled up with water, and almost all of the rain thereafter, after reaching saturation point, will now become surface runoff. And that is when things start to get riskier, because the soil is no longer able to absorb and reduce the amount of surface runoff. So let's move on to the influence of forest degradation. What happens when you have degraded forest is that your cover is low. You usually have a conversion of forest lands to farmlands. Illegal harvesting is still there. Encroachment into forest lands leading to forest cover, either for agriculture or for settlement or other human activities. Urban expansion, and then compaction of soil. These are common in areas where you have degraded forest. So what happens now to the water, especially surface runoff? Now, because the forest has been degraded and the soil has been compacted, your infiltration is going to be low, meaning to say the amount of water absorbed by the soil is going to be low, and surface runoff is going to be high. But again, as we said, or as I said in the previous slide, that influence of the forest, whether it's degraded or good forest, will only be material until before the soil is saturated. Once the soil is saturated, that role of the forest stops. Okay, and that that should also tell us that we cannot depend solely on reforestation as our strategy to minimize flooding event, because forests cannot good forests cannot absorb all the rain that will fall on it. There is a limit to that. And then faster surface runoff, because you have compacted soil, because you have poor cover to the soil, you have smoother surface, so to speak, because there is less trees and less vegetation growing on the ground, and you will have faster movement of surface runoff. And that is when you will have faster concentration of surface runoff to rivers. And when that happens, you know already that water will rise up quickly in the rivers. Add to that the high soil erosion that is usually associated with degraded forest area. And when you have high soil erosion, you expect that there will be siltation and shallowing of rivers, reducing further the capacity of the rivers to conduct safely water out to the sea. And then when your agroecosystem is degraded, meaning the agricultural areas, okay, this is what happens: soil erosion and fertility loss. Conversion to urban area is a source of agroecosystem degradation. Excessive use of chemical inputs and pollution, encroachment into forest lands leading to forest cover loss, and conversion of wetlands. Incidentally, about 35% of all forest lands converted to agriculture was converted directly without being logged. In other words, they were just cleared plainly for agriculture. And that is something that many don't understand. And that agriculture can be a very powerful cause of loss of forest cover simply by converting forest lands to agricultural lands. And 35% of our former forests were converted directly to agricultural lands. Now, so what happens when your agricultural areas are degraded? Again, you will have low surface runoff, a high surface runoff rather, because you have low infiltration because the soil has been degraded, compacted, lost its fertility and lost its ability to grow good vegetation cover. And this is true especially for agricultural areas in sloping lands. And then soil erosion and siltation of rivers. And then again, reducing the capacity of the river to conduct water safely out. Okay, so basically, that's the contribution of agroecosystem degradation to flood formation. And then urban ecosystem degradation. This is usually associated with congestion, expansion into agricultural lands and wetlands. And we're seeing this a lot. And this is something that the government should really focus on regulating, before we wake up one day that we don't have enough agricultural lands anymore. And worse is that we will also wake up that most of the remaining agricultural lands have already encroached into our forests. And that will be scarier. And then increase in impervious surfaces. And this is something that is so bad about urban expansion. We just keep on expanding our concrete jungles that cannot absorb water, and hence, just like in Metro Manila, even with small amount of rain, usually low-lying areas get flooded, because the rain cannot go anywhere except to flow on the surface. And then, excuse me, then illegal occupation of open spaces and easements. This includes occupation of drainage areas and occupation of, in Manila, esteros, and occupation of natural drainage waterways, like rivers. Okay, again, very common in Pasig, for instance, in Tuliahan River and the other rivers in Metro Manila. And these are, impeding the flow of water in these rivers that cause it to easily overflow, because of its limited ability already to contain water. Okay, so what happens? Again, low infiltration because of too much impervious surfaces and high surface runoff, therefore. And then soil erosion and siltation of rivers. And this is common, especially in agricultural lands being converted to urban areas or areas for real estate development, especially in construction, where you move a lot of earth, where you do a lot of earth movement and surface modification or alteration that eventually ends up with massive amount of soil that are washed away to the rivers, filling up the rivers with sediments. And then, of course, what happens? Reduced capacity of the river to conduct water, and then poor drainage due to constricted waterways. And this is what I said, when it is being occupied illegally, impeding the flow of river. Now let's talk about grassland degradation. Grasslands in the Philippines are periodically burnt, overgrazed. They are usually acidic and compacted. Soil erosion is pervasive, and productivity is simply nothing, almost nothing at all that you can grow and produce there. Okay, so with this grassland degradation, that will also contribute to low infiltration and high surface runoff. If you go to a grassland when it's raining, you will see that there's a lot of runoff that is moving through the grassy slopes, because one, you know, the grass roots are matted, and hence they, you know, they usually prevent efficient absorption of water by the soil. Plus, at the same time, most of the grasslands, again, you know, as I said, is already highly compacted because of um, being impoverished already by excessive loss of fertile soil on top, and what remains are mostly mineralized part of the soil horizon. And then fast surface runoff flow, and then fast concentration of water in streams, siltation of rivers, reducing capacity of a river to drain water properly. Okay, and then of course, river ecosystem degradation. You know, this is what we see in most of our rivers. Most of our riverine vegetation has been cleared for purposes that riverine areas have been cultivated or used for settlements, you know, and other purposes. And then most of our river channel has been altered, especially, you know, when an area is being developed for residential areas. They tend to modify the direction of the natural rivers, you know, causing most of them to be straightened. And when you straighten a river, you know, it's not always favorable, okay, to the flow of the river. Okay, I mean, alteration of the natural condition of the river can often lead to more serious problems, such as stream bed and stream bank erosion that can aggravate conditions for flood formation. And so, and then occupation of easements and so on. So what happens? Again, soil erosion and siltation of rivers, and then reduced capacity of the river, and poor drainage due to constricted waterways. Okay, and mangrove ecosystem degradation, on the other hand, this is what we see: deforestation, conversion to fish ponds, land reclamation, and of course, most of our mangroves now are suffering from sea level rise, and this is associated with climate change. So what happens when mangrove ecosystem degrades? We have reduced protection against wave action. Okay, and that is an important function of mangrove forest. And we do have reduced protection from storm surges. And of course, coastal erosion is taking place also in mangrove forest that has been cleared or degraded. Okay, so this is what happens. You know, this is what happens to a degraded ecosystems and watershed. They can actually compound the risks that are associated with excessive rainfall and the associated excessive runoff being produced. Now, if you have high drainage density watershed, I don't know what is happening. That's not mine. Okay, but ignore it, please. Ignore it. I don't know where that is coming from. My slide, you know, this slide was very clean as far as I'm concerned. So let's, you know, if you have a basin or watershed with high drainage density, steep slopes, where you have degraded forests, degraded agroecosystems, degraded grasslands, degraded urban ecosystems, degraded river ecosystem, you can add there, you know, degraded mangrove forest ecosystem. You will tend to have a greater risks of more serious flood. Okay, you can expect higher magnitude or higher level of flood, and also quick onset of flooding. Okay, compared to a watershed where with a low drainage density, less amount of branches of the rivers, and then more gentler slopes, more intact forest, more sustainable agroecosystem, more productive grasslands, well-managed urban ecosystem, and protected river ecosystems and mangroves. This is where you will see low flood and slow onset. As you can see, I'm very careful. I'm very careful not to say that there's not going to be any flood, if you have this ideal condition in your watershed, because flooding, as we said in the beginning, is natural and it can happen. It can happen even without the influence of humans or human activities. And then in between, of course, you have moderate flood. Now, the magnitude of impacts of ecosystem degradation is more prominent in smaller watersheds than in larger watersheds. In other words, if you mess around with smaller watersheds compared to the same mess that you make in the larger watersheds, your smaller watersheds will suffer more. Okay, it will suffer more from flooding. And remember that ecosystem behaviors are site-specific, and the magnitude of impacts of degradation of one ecosystem on other ecosystems and floods needs further research. So again, this is one area where we don't know much. Really contribute to the improvement of absorption of water by the soil. How much is it really? I said, it's about 35%, but that is more of a very generalized figure. Okay, but here in the Philippines, is it really that much only, or is it higher or lower than that? We don't know. And those are the things that we ought to understand more. And those are the areas for further study that ought to be a priority, by a research funding institution. So, what is the solution? The solution is, of course, to address the factors compounding risks from floods. Again, as I said, there's nothing much we can do about excessive rain or the soil characteristics. There's nothing much we can do about it. Okay, or there's nothing much we can do about the slope of the watershed, okay, or the number of streams in the watershed. But we can, those are natural factors. They can operate on their own without influence of human beings. But what we can influence are the factors that compounds the risk from flooding, and those are what we just discussed related to ecological degradation or ecosystem degradation. So we can do sustainable forest management, we can do sustainable upland development, sustainable agriculture, well-planned urban development, integrated coastal management. And these are all, these are all approaches that are, or that have been proven, effective in many areas. But we are still, on the we are still very slow, in implementing these approaches in our country, and there is still so much policy impediments, to actually make all these approaches effectively implemented, in our country. And of course, we need the whole watershed approach, meaning, our approach to minimizing risk to flooding is not only, or does not only depend on how well we manage and protect our forest or how well we reforest our forests. As I said, that influence of the good forest is just limited, but it is still good that we have good forest cover, because, whatever they contribute, that can add up, to the reduction of risk. And that we need, to address degradation of the uplands that are used for agriculture. We have to address the degradation of agricultural areas, and we have to address also the problems associated with urban development. You see, flooding, as a natural process, should not be a problem, really. It should not be a problem, really, except that, people insist on staying in areas that are naturally flooded areas or the floodplain. You know, history of flooding, has been recorded for a number of centuries, in some areas, and yet, during those times, forests are still intact, more or less, and yet they already have floods then. Okay, so meaning that it will happen, it will happen naturally. Okay, and the best way to not suffer from it is to avoid it, to avoid these areas that are usually flooded when the river overflows. Very well where human settlements ought to be and not ought to be, considering the risks from natural disasters such as flooding and from avoiding adverse impacts on the natural ecosystems. Okay. So my closing statements is that science helps us understand how natural system behaves as created by God. Okay, and that is, to me, that is the role of science. We're not discovering here new things, but what we are rediscovering are actually the way our natural systems were created by God. And knowing this and understanding this should not diminish our belief on the sovereignty of God over all creation and over entire natural system. And instead, we should be in greater awe of and reliance on God's power revealed through His creation. As we understand more and more of this, it should make us more beholden, to the power of God over everything, and not feel at all more sufficient now to handle the problem than before on our own. And then second is that whatever we know, whatever we understand through science, we are responsible for it, and we ought to be able to apply them in making wise decisions. And this is not only true for our lawmakers or policymakers and government officials, but this is also true on our own individual capacities. We can avoid risks, knowing how the natural system operates, but we know that it is part of the human fallen nature, that even if we know what the risks are, to us, we still continue doing those things that exposes us to risks, and this is nothing different, when it comes to people insisting on taking their chances, being in areas that are exposed to risk. Of course, there are people who don't have a choice or option, at all, to stay in areas that are safer. But this is also, this is also a social issue, a social issue where inequitable access to resources such as land resources put a lot of people who are unable to compete, to be exposed to greater risks than the region. But with God, He can do anything. He can do anything, even those things that will escape scientific explanation. We believe in the all-powerful God, who can do things, even those things that science will never be able to explain. And this does not prove inerrancy of the Bible, but it just proves the superiority of God's wisdom over man. And here, I hope we still have time to for discussion, but I hope that this gives you a a better, better handle on the process that are operating, in flooding events, and hopefully, make us more able to participate in the discussion, but more importantly, in trying to help others minimize their risks through flooding.